Good morning, students. Today we begin with the topic Puritan Age. In this lecture, I'll be talking about the socio-political history of this period. Puritan Age, that is 17th century. 17th century, England went through the most chaotic and violent phase. The stability and prosperity which was there during the period of Tudors ended with the death of Queen Elizabeth I, and during this period it faced setback. We have the new dynasty. After Tudor dynasty, there comes the Stuart dynasty, and they had the Scottish lineage. And this period, there were ongoing friction happening at different levels. There was this friction happening between Catholics and Protestant, and there was this conflict over the nature of government. That is, on one side there was this absolute monarchy, that is the belief that the king or queen had all of the power, and on the other side there was this commonwealth in which the people by way of elected or appointed officials have the power. And along with that, these Stuart kings, especially Charles I, insisted on this divine right theory. I hope you know this theory. Divine right theory states that the king ruled by virtue of God-given right. They had the power to rule over their land, and it was God-given power. That means they never entertained any kind of criticism or opposition against them. They never tolerated any kind of criticism or opposition. And this king had this power to override the parliament, and they stated that they are above the law of the land. That is known as divine right theory. And parliament completely opposed this notion, and there emerged this friction between the king and the parliament, the crown and the parliament, which resulted in civil war and the overthrowing of monarchy, which happened with the beheading of Charles I. And then there is a short phase of Commonwealth period, and later there is restoration of monarchy, restoring monarchy. Who are Puritans? The Puritans were all those English Protestants in the 16th and 17th century, and their main aim was to purify the Church of England of Roman Catholic practices. And they maintained that Church of England had not been fully reformed and it should become more Protestant. And they found it necessary to be in a covenant relationship with God in order to be redeemed from one sinful condition. And they also believed that there shouldn't be any kind of intermediaries between individual and God. So in Catholic Church you have these intermediaries like clergies, bishops, and most importantly Pope. These Puritans were against this idea. They completely opposed episcopacy. Episcopacy, this is this hierarchical order in a church. So they were completely critical of this organized structure of church. They believed that there should not be any kind of a mediator between an individual and God. And they also considered scriptures as supreme, the scriptures of Bible as supreme, and they completely rejected all those earthly pleasures, like all those entertainments, etc. Puritanism thus emerged in England during 16th and 17th century, and they, as I said earlier, they completely opposed episcopacy and monarchy. The church governed by bishops and the state ruled by the king were equally detestable to them. So this is the historical background. Puritan Age started with around 1600 to 1660. 1660, there is this restoration of monarchy. So mainly the struggle between the crown and parliament. We should discuss the struggle between crown and parliament. As I said earlier, Stuart age started with James first, and there was this uneasiness under Stuart kings. As I said earlier, the stability and prosperity during the period of Tudors faced setback during this period. There were all those internal troubles happening. There were, as I said earlier, there were a lot of frictions happening at different levels. So there was this uneasiness, general uneasiness under the Stuart kings. And along with that, kings' divine right theory made the problem worse. The king's right to override parliaments and the laws of the lands were criticized, and later it broke out into a civil war under the rule of Charles I. So this started, Stuart dynasty started with James I, and it broke out, the civil war broke out during the period of the next king, that is Charles I. And basically it happened due to this ineptitude of Stuart kings to sense the mood of the people. And religion was the major cause of discord, major cause of struggle. Although Protestants, the Stuart kings, were tolerant, and these Stuart kings were Protestants, but they were tolerant and sympathetic towards Roman Catholics. And these Puritans and Anglicans were enraged at Stuart kings' tolerance towards Catholics. Though this Stuart kings adopted Anglican Church as official religion, they strongly opposed Puritans. And these Puritans had a stronghold among urban settlers and trading classes. Along with that, Puritans controlled lower house of parliament, which naturally resulted in this conflict with the king. So there started this religious struggle. Puritans were against Stuart King's support of Catholics, and there was this discord happening around the issue of taxation too. Stuart kings started imposing certain tax at their own will, and it was said that it was to finance their lifestyle and invasions happening during that time. We understand that it was during this period all those colonial expansions were happening, and all these Stuart kings imposed taxes on the common people to finance their own lifestyle and to support these invasions. And Parliament did not agree with this. Parliament didn't relent for taxation without its consent. And there was this friction happening. And then comes this civil war. In the civil war, we have two sides. The people these people sided two factions. One faction was loyal to the king and the other opposed to him. So this was the first group, Cavaliers or Royalists, which contained clergy, nobility, and all those in favor of the king. And on the other side, we have Roundheads or parliamentarians, which contained middle class. Those were in favor of the parliament. And London was then a stronghold of the Puritans, and so the king went out of it to gather forces. And majority of the nobles, gentry, and the people of the countryside supported the king, while All these middle class yeomen and townsmen were ardent parliamentarians. And the immediate cause of the civil war was this attempted arrest of five members of House of Commons and uh, the uh, the king's refusal to place militia under parliamentary command. King wanted military under his control and he completely refused to place this military under the control of parliament. So these are the two immediate causes of the beginning of this civil war. And cities and towns supported parliament, and Royal Navy, which was the side of parliament, also uh, also were part of the civil war. And Puritan leaders started a faction which was known as a New Model Army under Sir Thomas Fairfax, and here comes Oliver Cromwell with his cavalry named Ironsides. And after all those initial success was always initial success went to royalist side, but later these royalists started facing all those defeats, and King Charles surrendered in 1646. But later he started a second civil war. The second civil war was also a failure, and after that, this model army which contained, as I said earlier, which contained all those Puritan leaders, decided that they should do away with the king. And for this, the cooperation of the parliament was also required, and parliament also supported this idea. And it resulted in the execution of King Charles I in 1649. And what made these civil wars unique? These civil wars were different from earlier internal strifes. For example, they had this internal strife, great internal strife. We can mention this War of the Roses. So, War of the Roses was actually a series of feudal wars fought only by feudal aristocracy. But when we take the case of civil war, we see that there was this participation of masses. Masses were mere onlookers, mere observers in the case of War of Roses. But here, in this fight between crown and parliament, common people also took sides. So the fight between the crown and parliament was actually a national struggle in which almost all the people were involved. And it was called as war of ideas in church and state. So more than a physical struggle, it was a struggle of ideas, war of ideas in church and state. And it made people more politically conscious. The issues of the war were discussed by all and every Englishman. And every Englishman was either a royalist or parliamentarian. All these people took sides. And basically, as I said earlier, it was a struggle between aristocracy and middle class. While this bulk of the nobility and gentry fought for the king, the majority of the merchants and towns, rich yeomen, sided with parliamentarians. And another result was this: the power and influence of cities like London increased as their men played decisive role in the civil war. And what are the results? One of the greatest results of the Civil War was the triumph of Puritanism. There started a Puritan regime with the beheading of Charles I in 1649 to 1660. We had this Puritan regime. It actually resulted in the abolition of monarchy, and it deeply affected the system of government. Now we have this Puritan ideals, which became the directive principles of the Commonwealth and Protectorate. And along with that, the another result of this civil war was that it fostered a national consciousness. The English and the Scots formed an alliance on the ground of religion and fought together against royal tyranny and the oppression of this church, that is, established church, Church of England. And another result was the triumph of the common law over its rivals. The Puritan Revolution actually abolished all those royal courts, which had been a kind of instruments of oppression. And lastly, the English society was influenced by the new ideas during and after this Puritan rebellion. So these are the factors which make a civil war unique. And then we come to the major architect of Puritanism, Puritan victory, Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell was the chief architect of Puritan victory in the Civil War. As you know, he had this cavalry, Ironside, which supported new model army. That is, all those Puritan leaders. And in 1653, Cromwell becomes the protector of this Puritan Commonwealth, and he continued in this power up to his death in 1658. And it is said that he ruled the country like an uncrowned king. It is, it is written in the history that there is no single person who wielded so much power as Cromwell did in the history of England. As you know, he was not a royal person or even an aristocrat. He was actually a gentleman or an ordinary country gentleman of yeoman stock. And he is known as a strong Puritan with an iron fist and practical mind. All power concentrated on him, and the main aim was to promote the interest of people of God. According to him, the main aim was to promote the interest of the people of God. So these are the impacts of Puritan rule. During this period, from 1649 to 1660, Puritan ideals become ruling ideals. And Puritans stressed on purity, simplicity, and austerity. Their life was Bible oriented. As I said earlier, scriptures ruled supreme in their life. They had no guide except Bible in their world. They spend their time in Bible reading, family prayers, fast, penance, and they completely avoided all those entertainments. They were completely against singing, dancing, drinking, and all sorts of merrymaking. And these Puritans prohibited all those stage plays and closed theaters because, as I said earlier, they were against all those entertainments. They believed that, they argued that these stage plays or these performances will not kind of give any contain any kind of moral values. So they completely discarded all these things, and they had this law of code to punish all those sinners who went against these rules given by Puritans. And these Puritan Sabbaths and Parliament feast were strictly enforced. It is said that even soldiers, were empowered to enter private kitchens in London to know whether these people broke the rules of fasting on certain days by cooking and eating meat. They issued ordinances against drunkenness, dueling, cockfighting, bear baiting, and horse racing. And they were not allowed to have these sports and games on Sundays. So they stressed more on a Bible oriented life, and they completely avoided all those things related to entertainment. And there is this famous comment by Trevelyan who says the Puritans made men eat religion with their bread. So they were forced to eat religion with their bread till, till the taste of it sickened them. And as you know, it was not so easy to change the character of people of a nation by using force. This England was always known as Merry England. Merry England. So, Merry England continued her life, especially in rural areas, undisturbed by these strict rules enforced by Puritanism. And later, in 1660, they go back to monarchy. They got sickened with the rules enforced by Puritanism, and then we have this restoration of monarchy. After the war, the Puritans remained dominant in England until 1660, but there was this quarrel happening in the Puritan regime. They had these factions like Presbyterians, Independents, and there were a lot of conflict happening between them. And that led to the weakening of this Puritan regime and the restoration of monarchy. And it is said that these Puritan regimes proved even more intolerant than the old hierarchy. The restoration of the monarchy happened in 1660, which restored Anglicanism, and Puritan clergies were expelled from Church of England under the terms of this Act of Uniformity. Thereafter, English Puritans were classified as nonconformist. So there ended their regime. That is, with the restoration of monarchy, which happened in 1660, there was this restoration of Anglican religion and the restoration of the king. Charles II comes to power. And from there on, Puritans were classified as nonconformist. Here I end my lecture. Hope it is clear. Thank you. Have a nice day.